send an email.
Het is net alsof we een soort van radiopresentatie doen.
All right, and we are live.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to this webinar Digital Summit on how to measure a positive impact on biodiversity as a financial institution. We are a little bit late, so we are really happy that you're still online. My name is Caroline van Leenders. I will do the introduction and moderation of this hour. We have a few other speakers that I will introduce along the way. I'm waiting on my slides. They are not there yet, but hopefully somewhere they will pop up. To give a bit of context to this webinar, we have today 4 speakers, and I will do a short introduction. Then we have Wijnand Boer of CREM. He has been working very closely with ASM Bank and a few other financials on developing a method, the biodiversity footprinting for financial institutions, BFFI method. You will hear everything about it later. Then we have online David Alvarez from Spain, the executive director over there. So he will tell us about the developments in Spain recently on biodiversity and finance. And we will close the webinar with Anna Krotova from GRI. GRI, very important, of course, is guidelines for reporting, becoming the standard. So what are they doing on biodiversity, and how will an update on biodiversity look like for the coming year? These are our 3 speakers. Well, the short introduction without my slides, but a little bit of context. In the Netherlands, I work for the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, Nature and Food Quality. And from the Netherlands, we have been supporting greening the financial sector for the last 5 years. We do that by facilitating the work of frontrunners. That is from a transition theory. We use transition theory as our theory of change. And the whole idea is that you facilitate frontrunners, especially coalitions of frontrunners that work on a common ground for methods and tools and insights. Next to that, we support the awareness of more mainstream players, and we help our Dutch central bank with research on financial risk related to biodiversity loss. So we try to do different things at the same time: frontrunners, mainstream, and regulators. And we also have a more international strain of work, which is directed at showcasing and connecting the financial sector to the big event next year in Kunming in China, the Convention on Biological Diversity, with hopefully a deal for nature. Well, in all this work with supporting frontrunners, the first few years was on measuring your impact, more your negative impact on biodiversity. But banks like the ASM Bank, but also Finance in Motion, CDC Biodiversity, other financial players want to take next steps, go to a positive impact on biodiversity, and that leads to new questions on how to measure that. And I think that some of the details of those questions will be on the table today. We also are looking for other countries that might have an interest in supporting the financial sector up to the CBD. So this is also a call to some of the people listening or being online. If you live in a country that is interested to support the financial sector on biodiversity and be active in next year, the super year for biodiversity, so please contact us. I think that those are the last words. I had some nice slides of turning things upside down, but I would ask a lot of your imagination. But if we are moving on to Wijnand, we need slides as well, because to try to explain what steps you have to take to make biodiversity impact measurable, it is handy if we have some graphic support. So, Selina, this is to the of GLF. Are the slides coming up?
Hello. Sorry. It seems like I'm having some trouble pulling these slides up.
Okay.
So let me continue to try, but if it's possible, for someone else to share them, that would be great as well. But let's see if I can get this open.
Okay. Well, that's a question that we will try to solve. Maybe I'll come over to you, and then we will work on your visual support as well as we can. Wijnand Boer.
Yeah, no problem. Well, Wijnand Boer, working with CREM Consultancy and working with ASN Bank since 2014, basically. Working on the topic of biodiversity. Biodiversity is one of the three, well, we have slides. Biodiversity for ASN Bank is one of the three key pillars for sustainability that they work on. So it's biodiversity, it's working on human rights and on climate change. Well, this is my slide, actually. I will explain a bit more about the methodology that we use to do the impact assessment with ASN Bank. Basically, what we look at is the main drivers of biodiversity loss are some key environmental pressures. And then we're talking about, for example, climate change, we're talking about land use, we're talking about pollution. And the big question, of course, for the bank is how, through their investments, they are contributing to those drivers of biodiversity loss. And to get an insight in the impact that they have as a bank, we developed the BFFI, the Biodiversity Footprint Financial Institutions, together with Pre-Sustainability in the Netherlands. And it's basically a 4-step approach. So we look at the first step is to make clear what are you actually investing in. And that sounds as an easy step, but is still a lot of work, you could say. For example, if you invest in a company like Nike, then what are you investing in? Are you investing in a retailer? Or are you also responsible maybe for the production of cotton further up the supply chain? So these kind of questions need to be answered in this first step. We have to make clear what the bank invests in. Second step is that when you know what they invest in, what emissions are linked to the economic activities that they invest in, and what land use is related to these economic activities. And these inputs and outputs will also determine what their contribution is to the pressures of biodiversity loss. And that's basically step 3. So if you have emissions from greenhouse gas emissions, for example, you will contribute to climate change. And climate change will somehow also contribute to an impact on biodiversity. And the step 3 to 4, which is from climate change, for example, to the impact on biodiversity, is based on pressure response modeling. Which is basically looking at the different pressures that you have and how do they end up in one impact on biodiversity. I will show a bit more about that in the next slide. The result of what we do with BFFI and ASN Bank is an overview of impact hotspots on a portfolio level. So we can see on a portfolio level where the hotspots are. Because as a bank, you cannot focus on every company that you invest in. You will need to get an idea of where your impact is located. And that's what this BFFI methodology brings to the bank. So if they want to work on their objective, and they have an objective of being a net positive in 2030 on biodiversity, you can use this methodology. In the screen now, you see this third step, and that's the step where you have emissions and resource use, like also the emission of greenhouse gas emissions, that will end up in environmental pressures like climate change, and I put a red circle around it. And these environmental pressures are translated into biodiversity loss using the recipe impact assessment module, and that is basically what you see in front of you right now. It's based on scientific knowledge. And it actually combines the different pressures into one score, one end score. And this end score is a potentially disappeared fraction of species per square meter per year, which is still a rather complicated unit, you might say, if you will need to explain it. And for the bank, we actually simplify this into the loss of square meters of biodiversity per euro invested. And that's the kind of unit that also speaks to the bank and also speaks to the investors within the bank, and they can actually calculate for their investments what the loss of biodiversity will be for the different choices that they have in their investments. Interesting to see that there's also a clear link, of course, to carbon accounting. Most of the financial institutions already work on carbon accounting. And carbon is, of course, one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And what you see with ASN Bank is that the work that they've done on carbon already is also, we feed that into the biodiversity footprint. And so the data that they already have available on carbon are used also to calculate the impact on biodiversity. The extra value of the biodiversity footprint, maybe over a carbon footprint, is that the fact that the biodiversity footprint looks at all different pressures. So not just the pressure from climate change, but also the pressure, let's say, from water use, from land use, etc. And the interesting thing of that is that you will also see trade-offs. So, for example, if you would invest in something like biofuel, the carbon accounting or the carbon footprint might be positive, you could say. But when you look at the biodiversity footprint, you can also see the trade-offs of an investment in biofuel, which could, for example, be land use. So you will see in the biodiversity footprint how the different pressures relate. And when you bring down one pressure, let's say climate change, it may have a negative effect on another pressure, let's say land use, for example. And that's one of the benefits also for a financial institution. By using a footprint on biodiversity, you can also see how the different pressures communicate with each other. And that will also offer extra information for investment decisions. So decisions can be made based on more information than just the carbon footprint. And of course, the idea is to look in the end for the win-win investments, where you both have a positive effect on your carbon footprint, but also have a positive effect on your biodiversity footprint. And that's also the way it's being used right now. Maybe to the next slide. It's a bit slow, but it's also very complicated. The next step, of course, is to, for the ASM Bank at least, is also to see how do we get to our objective. And like I explained, their objective in 2030 is to be net positive, so to have a net gain on biodiversity on a portfolio level. And there are different steps to reach that objective. One might think that you could start compensating for negative impacts, but that's of course not the first step. The first step should always be try to avoid negative impacts, because otherwise compensation might also end up being a license to trash. So what you see here is the mitigation hierarchy, which has also been used by the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, BBOP, in the last few years. And it shows that you have different steps to take if you want to reach a no net loss or a net gain. You start with avoiding. And for example, a financial institution could do that by also excluding certain sectors or companies from their investments. The next step would be to minimize an impact. And that could be done, for example, through investment criteria. ASM Bank has a lot of different biodiversity-related investment criteria already in place. So they're also working on minimization. But you may still have a residual impact after that. And you could try, in the end, you want to compensate for this residual impact and maybe even invest in positive impacts to also reach a net gain. And that's what this picture shows. And that's also the phase where the bank is in now. The focus of the next year will very much be on these positive investments, how to deal with those. Next slide, please. Yeah, because you might think, well, a positive investment is all very straightforward to increase the level of biodiversity. But basically, if you look into the question of what is actually a biodiversity positive investment, you could have different categories of investments. Is, for example, a biodiversity positive investment an increase in biodiversity, like, for example, land restoration? Or could it also be a reduction of a negative impact? So if you invest in good agricultural practices, or maybe certification, maybe FSC certification of forestry, for example, can it also be considered a positive investment? Another example is the avoidance of a negative impact, for example, by investments in green energy, where you have avoided carbon emissions, and by avoiding carbon emission, you will also have a positive impact on biodiversity, because climate change is one of the major reasons for biodiversity loss. So the question is also, can all of these different types of investments be used to reach a no net loss or a net gain? And maybe also the question, to what extent? If you want to reach a no net loss as a financial institution, is it okay to compensate only by investing in green energy? Is that the solution? Or should you also invest in actually increasing the level of biodiversity? These are important questions that we want to look at the coming year. Also the question, positive compared to what? There has to be some kind of a reference situation. And you have to compare the result of an investment to the situation that would have been there if you did not do the investment. And also very important, and also very much linked to the work of the Global Reporting Initiative, is the question how to report on these investments. An example, if as a financial institution you want to reach a no net loss, do you only report on the balance, the end balance, so maybe you are net positive, or do you need to report on all your negative investments and your biodiversity positive investments separately? Has to be fully transparent of where the negative impacts are and where the positive impacts are. And it's an important question also for stakeholders, to what level a financial institution should be transparent in this respect. Good questions, very important questions, also not always very easy to answer. This last year, we've been working on a report that you see on the right side. And when we share the slides, you will also find a direct link to the report itself, where we have tried to answer part of these questions already, also in cooperation with ASN Bank. And in the coming year, the idea is to start with a larger group of financial institutions to work in the Partnership Biodiversity Accounting Financials, PBAF, which you could say is the small brother of PCAF, the platform or partnership carbon accounting financials, which is very successful internationally by now. And with this group of financial institutions, we want to work on a common ground paper. So the basics on biodiversity positive investments that we agree on. So how do you deal with the questions that I just also discussed? We will also work on some cases with the PBAF, so also some footprint calculation cases, and the common ground paper that we hope to come up with in around April, May, share it with a larger group of financials, and in the end also present the common ground during the COP15 in Kunming. That's a bit of the future that what we're looking at right now. And with that, I think it's good to maybe turn back to Caroline.
So, okay, so how do I get rid of this? Yeah, so maybe, yeah, thank you. In the meantime, if you have questions, please post them online and we look through them, and we'll take some out for Wijnand maybe to come back to later. There are some questions about sharing slides and stuff like that. I don't think that will be a problem. There are also some specific questions about people from Uganda and of other places of the world of how to take next steps in my own country or in my own situation. We might go into that if there's time, and otherwise I'll be on the line later. So maybe moving forward to the next speaker, David Alvarez. Please tell us. We have been given a little introduction about the situation here in the Netherlands, with some players from countries like France and Germany being part of this work. How is the situation in Spain? Are investors interested in biodiversity? Is it coming on the agenda? Could you please give us a little insight from your country?
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this nice webinar. Okay, I'll explain a little bit of what's EcoAXA to let you understand what are we doing and what's the situation right now in Spain. We are a small company. We are also representing the Natural Capital Coalition and the Future Capitals Coalition in Spain through the regional platform, which is called Natural Capital Factory. And we are also working with the European Commission through the Business and Biodiversity Initiative, and we are members of the advisory board. And we have also taken part of the sustainable plan for the action plan for sustainable finance. We have been part of the expert group who developed the so-called taxonomy to classify the different activities around the world, or maybe mainly around Europe, in order to know which are more sustainable or not. And we're also taking part of the with the Statistical Commission of the United Nations to develop a common ground for how to use the CF framework from natural accounting into businesses. So next slide, please. Can you please go? Okay, if you can you please go to the next slide? Okay, thank you so much. Moving, getting back to your question, Caroline, about which are developments in Spain and how is it going on. As I mentioned previously, we are running the Natural Capital Factory, which is the most important platform in Spain regarding natural capital and how to deal with biodiversity and how to integrate biodiversity within the business models. In these platforms, there are different working lines, and one of them are working groups. Within this working group, we have worked in depth during this year with the energy sector in order to address which are the impacts and dependencies on natural capital and how they can calculate them in a common ground. This has been made by request of these energy companies, and one of the main drivers that move them to do that is because the financial institutions are requesting them for different information regarding which are their impact and dependencies. Are Spanish investors moving to impact measurement? It depends on who do you ask for. I mean, if you ask directly to banks, they are not strictly moving to calculate these impacts. But if you ask to impact funds, they do. In case of banks, they are much more aware of climate change issues and which are their impact regarding climate change and how can they calculate them. And in order to change this situation and to integrate the community, the finance community in Spain, we have created a working group on biodiversity and natural capital for the finance community. We have set that group at the end of this year, and we are going to start to work with them at the beginning of next year. We are leading this working group in collaboration with Spainsif. Spainsif is the most important Spanish organization regarding sustainable and responsible investment, and they have on board more than 60 financial institutions, and we are also joined other financial institutions through the Natural Capital Factory. And the goals of this working group are going to be similar, as Caroline mentioned previously, to find a common ground to see how can they tackle how can they address biodiversity in different ways. First, how biodiversity is important for them. Second, how can they measure their impact in biodiversity? And thirdly, how can they mobilize funding to improve biodiversity? There is one example that I would like to come up here in this webinar, where 2 years ago we participate in the development of the financial supplement of the Natural Capital Protocol. In order to do so, we participate with Bankinter. Bankinter is a medium-sized bank in Spain, very aware of climate change, natural capital, and biodiversity loss. For this work, we developed a methodology to assess quite similar in somehow to what Wagner mentioned previously, in order to calculate their impact and dependencies at portfolio level. To do so, we assess all the NAICE codes or where this bank invests in order to know in which of these activities do they have more impact on different areas of natural capital, water, climate change, biodiversity, and emissions. And of course, not only impact, but also to see which are their dependencies on biodiversity and natural capital in order to see which could be the risk in the portfolio level. As I mentioned, Spanish banks are more aware on climate change than biodiversity at this time, but biodiversity is getting more and more an important issue for them. And it's important as well to note that in the draft that our current government is preparing for the new climate change regulation, biodiversity is going to be taken into account in somehow in climate risk, and financial institutions are going to, it's going to be mandatory to make a report on their climate related risk, and probably which are how these risks are related or are impacting on biodiversity. Let's see in the next months how this finally lands on the ground, but it's a good news that all banks in Spain should report on their impacts on climate change. Regarding the future and how all these things are moving on to the super year of biodiversity, 1 month ago, more or less, we organized in collaboration with the European Commission and also with the Ministry of Ecological Transition in Spain, the European Business and Nature Summit. It was a success meeting with more than 300 people speaking around biodiversity and natural capital, and how can we measure it, and how can biodiversity could be implemented in a good way into company strategies and company operation. The most, or one of the most important outcomes from this summit was that there is a great increasingly momentum on biodiversity, at least at European level and in practice in Spain. And what companies told us is that they are very, how do you say, they are very aware of what our financial institutions are thinking about this. It's important to see that during this meeting there were not only business as usual, that it's the common kind of attendees to this summit. There were a lot of financial institutions, and that's something that other businesses consider in a very good way, to see that there is a an increasing awareness of this issue for financial institutions. So that means that they need to start working on this, and it's something that has shifted the behavior in some Spanish business as a signal of it. For instance, yesterday, the Spanish working group on green growth, which is one of the largest Spanish business associations on green economy, signed a working protocol with the region of Madrid, which is the most important region in Spain in terms of economy, which is a really good sign. And we are starting to create the roadmap to see what could we do, what could we do for the coming in China at the end of the year. And that's all from my side at the moment. Happy to answer whatever question you have.
Very small question from my side. Is there any sign of companies and financials that are already developing an ambition to become biodiversity positive, of no net loss or net gain? Or is that maybe a bit too early to say?
I think it's a little bit early to say. They are setting some targets and goals regarding climate change, but at this time, I think it's too early for biodiversity.
Okay. Well, if we work together, we can share, of course, the insights from our side and.
Of course. As I mentioned, we have the first meeting of this working group in January, and after this, we will have a clear picture of what do they need for the future. I think that they are very interested to integrate in somehow biodiversity within their portfolio assessments and within their strategies, but they don't really know how to do it at the moment. In other countries like yours, in the Netherlands, where you have been working in this arena since 4 or 5 years ago, it's a little bit easier because they are more aware of what can they do or how much important is this for their portfolio assessment. But at this time here, we have very front runners in climate change. For instance, BBVA, which is a great bank, has strong targets on climate change, and others like Santander. But in terms of biodiversity, they don't really know what they have to do to this. Sure. To do this. So the initiative that Wijnand mentioned to create a common ground on how to measure biodiversity should be very helpful, to join all the Spanish banks and Spanish financial institutions to join that, or to create something similar that could be applied here in Spain. And of course, to create linkages between and among the different initiatives around Europe.
Sure.
I think we should work together to a common goal, which is to end with the biodiversity loss.
Sure. Yeah, completely agree. Harmke, are there any questions that we can take now from the audience, or shall we'll do the last presentation and then see if there's time for the questions online? So please, for the last one, Anna Krotova, GRI, Manager Standards. Could you please take the audience on a little tour of what's been happening, and do we get new standards, better standards for biodiversity, and will there be room for reporting on a positive impact on biodiversity?
So, absolutely, yes. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute today. I see we have the slides very well. So just to give a short introduction for those of you who might be coming to this webinar from more of a biodiversity background rather than a sustainability reporting background. So GRI is an international independent non-for-profit organization that sets standards for corporate sustainability reporting. And it has been started 20 years ago to start the practice, or created 20 years ago to start the practice of non-financial reporting or sustainability reporting. And its core product is the GRI standards, also known perhaps by some of you as the G4 guidelines, which is their previous version. And today they are the most widely used standards for corporate reporting. The standards are voluntary. However, today there are about 145 policies in 62 countries that reference or require the use of GRI standards. So that includes both capital market regulations like stock exchanges or national policies. And for those of you in Europe, probably the most known policy will be the EU Directive on Non-Financial Reporting that mandates all listed companies above 500 employees in size to report their non-financial information, and they reference GRI as a framework to use. So if I could go to the next slide, please. And I'm sorry for the popping noises. I'm going to turn off all of my applications. So I think what is interesting and unique about the GRI is the standard setting process. So the standard setting activity is mandated by a standalone body of GRI. It's separate from all GRI activities. It's called the Global Sustainability Standards Board, the GSSB, and their only mandate is to set and update standards. Their work is governed by a due process protocol, which is a set of rules or guidelines for how to develop a standard. And in that due process, there are two very important criteria. So one is that standard setting process should be based on a multi-stakeholder input. That means that we convene, when we update a standard, expert groups that consist of leading experts in their fields, representing civil society organizations, business institutions, investment institutions, labor organizations, and mediating institutions, which is a catch-all group for intergovernmental organizations like agencies of the UN system, for example. And so, as well, all standards go through public consultation. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two for certain standards, and stakeholder workshops around the world. And so we consolidate all of that feedback from our stakeholders and bring that back to our expert groups for them to incorporate further in the standard. And another key criteria in that due process protocol is full transparency. So that means that all key papers on standard development and all meetings that are discussing the standards approval are in fact open to public on the GSSB website, so you can follow them, you can listen to these meetings and understand the discussion and the key decisions that are taken around the development of these standards. And so these two criteria ensure that the standards are really balanced in their in the interests, I suppose, that they reflect, and that they are that the content that they have is both meaningful in terms of what we need to understand about a topic, what we need to measure about it, and are feasible to report, and as also presented in a format that is usable to the data user, whoever that will be. A brief note on the content of the GRI standards. So they consist of 4 series. One is a universal series, which includes standards that set the basic principles for how to prepare a sustainability report. So basically a how-to guide. And in that, in those standards, there's a principle, Weinert, which answers the questions that you tagged in the beginning, and that's a principle of balance of representation of information. So that means that we are asking companies to report both on their positive and negative impacts in as balanced and transparent way as possible for anybody to make then an unbiased and sort of complete assessment of an organization's performance. So we're really not looking at results from a net, net impact perspective, where we want to understand all favorable information about the performance for then the data user to make a call on that themselves. So that is, I suppose, an important contribution to your discussion that you're having and the developments that are happening right now around biodiversity in terms of how to look at these positive and negative impacts. And then in our topic-specific standards, the 3 series, we have standards related to economic topics, environmental, and social. And so in our economic standards, we have, for example, standards on economic performance, a standard on tax, which we launched in fact, last week. I'm very proud of that. It's big work. In our economic series, we have standards on water and effluents, waste, energy, emissions, materials, and a standard on biodiversity. And in our social standards, we have we have standards on issues like child labor, forced labor, rights of indigenous peoples, human rights, and so on. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit finally about our standard on biodiversity, which, as I've said, is one among the environmental series standards, and it's been around already for about 10 years. And in there, we have the following disclosures. So we're asking companies to report, first of all, on the operational activities that may have an impact on biodiversity. And we're looking at that from a perspective of operational activities being located nearby or within protected areas or areas of high biodiversity value outside protected areas that are affected, as well as these operational activities affecting IUCN Red List species and National Conservation List species. We're also asking companies to report the nature of impact of activities, products, and services. And by nature of impact, we mean whether that's pollution, whether that's introduction of invasive species and pests and pathogens, whether that's reduction of species, whether that's habitat conversion, or changes in ecological processes. And we're also looking at the significance of that impact. So whether, so the extent of areas affected, the duration of that impact, and whether it is reversible or irreversible. And then finally, on the positive side, we're looking at the extension of an organization's prevention and remediation activities with respect to the impact that they have made. And so that, in there, we're looking for habitat areas that are protected and restored, including their size, their location, and their condition at the end and at the close of the reporting period. So this standard is put forward and submitted to the GSSB for an update with a proposal to update it in 2020. We are clearly observing a lot of interest from our stakeholders and in the sustainability network around this topic, and so it seems true what they say about the high year, the super year of biodiversity that's going to be next year, and so we'll be working with experts to reflect basically the best practice that is happening ahead of Kunming and reflect that in the standard. So what I would be interested in about is to understand from participants on the call is, what are the indicators that you need to understand the impact on biodiversity and a company's performance with respect to biodiversity that we could bring into our standard that are already not in there. So I'll stop it there and leave us some time for discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe some extra questions from my side. So we published this report on how to measure positive impact. There is already the Common Ground report on how to measure your negative impact. So there are some indicators being developed. I discussed this, Wijnand, before we started. There are different organizations who are looking at these kind of impact reporting. IUCN has a method. So there are different methods being developed, but they all are kind of similar. They are something about square meters and some species, something with species and square meters. So is this also the kind of indicator that you think at the end of the day that you will be prescribing, or is that maybe a step too fast? So what kind of level indicators are you looking at? Because when I looked at the indicators as they are now, they are much about very high biodiversity areas, but I think that biodiversity is everywhere. And so how will you make it something that is not only about very special species, but about all life on this planet? And what kind of indicators are you looking for? So that would be my first question. We're still looking at what participants are asking, so maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So of course, not being an expert in biodiversity, I cannot, and having not actually even started the revision yet, I cannot say what these indicators will be. But hearing from the network, what's really sort of missing or needs to be reflected a little bit better is indeed proxies around, so going beyond a little bit perhaps the protected areas only type of an indicator. So looking more broadly at other areas that are affected, such as other areas and other stocks, I suppose. So oceans, forests, land, etc. Yeah, I think exactly. I think things like the functionality of ecosystems, although these are very it seems these are the things that the community is now trying to sort of wrap their head around. That how do you put a figure on that? How do you measure that? Things around the thresholds of ecosystems, understanding what other sensitive areas exist that are not protected that we should be affecting. So the stocks I was talking about, and also more information about the targets and the management processes and actions that organizations are taking, because certainly habitats restored and protected might not be just the only proxy to understand the positive contribution that the organization making. The other part that we notice is missing in our standard at the moment is really understanding impacts on the value chain. So impacts of commodities that companies procure that are not really heavy manufacturers, but really are, for example, investing in these type of commodities as their primary business. So expanding the value chain scope and looking at tier 2, tier 3 impacts, I think, is something that will also come up as an area of improvement.
Or maybe something of it, because one of the things that is very central in IP-BEST, but then also in these different methods, is the drivers for biodiversity loss. Maybe is that something that you have some ideas on what that would be for KPIs and stuff like that?
Well, I think some of them are already addressed in the current indicators by GRI. I think what will be very interesting for the revision of GRI is the fact that since 10, 15 years ago, a lot has happened. So you have the Natural Capital Protocol. Very soon you also have a biodiversity supplement to the Natural Capital Protocol. There has been a lot of development in the area of impact assessment by ASM Bank, but also CDC Biodiversity. UNEP is working on an aligning measures initiative. So I think it will be very interesting to combine the knowledge that has been created in the last few years to see how you could further develop the GRI indicators.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, GRI really is a convener, and in that it's unique because it has a neutral role to play in that it brings and it builds on the knowledge that is there already to ensure that we're finding the consensus around these different or between these different initiatives and indicators, etc., such that these impacts can be measured universally. So certainly, we're not planning to develop anything completely, left or different, but really build on what's there already.
No, and also interesting and something that I was wondering. I know that in Madrid, the conference was already mentioned by David. Is that there is also a Framework for Nature initiative and similar initiatives that focus on reporting on nature by financial institutions. Is GRI directly involved with those initiatives?
Well, not yet. I have to say that we are in a very early stage of thinking about the revision. So we've yet to submit the proposal to our board for approval to start next year. But as soon as we have the green light to go ahead, we will be reaching out to the network. So it would be valuable to get all the leads of who's working on this and who should be approached in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can also add something, I will offer our platform to make these consultations in Spain if you need, of course.
Thank you. That is, yes, valuable.
because I think we should all work together in order to do so. And the work you're doing for the revision of the GRI for the future, I think it's going to be very important, at least in Spain, where most of our largest companies are reporting through GRI. So if we have a common ground to integrate biodiversity in a largest way in GRI reports from our big companies, that could be a very good step ahead in preserving biodiversity.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Okay, well, great. This little webinars digital summit already led to some new collaborations. People already know each other, but never too late to reinforce. There are two questions on the line that I just want to give a very quick answer. One is from Uganda, how in Uganda you can take next steps with natural capital thinking. I would like to tell you that there is this natural capital, the Natural Capital Coalition will have a big event in Uganda next year, so I will link you up to them and maybe that can help you further. Another question was from Germany, where they started a platform for eco-restoration, landscape restoration, how to find finance for landscape restoration. Well, this is the million-dollar question, I suppose. Not very easy to get financials on board. We have an organization in the Netherlands called Common Land. They have been trying to get a private finance as their investors, but only have until now found family funds to want to invest, so not yet making it commercial. So it's not easy. They are bringing out a very, very interesting report made by KPMG on the investment bridge for landscape restoration. It's coming out one of these weeks, months. So also maybe I can share it with you. And I think that also this discussion, how are we going to invest? Because this was about measuring your positive impact, but the next step will be to invest with a positive impact. Landscape restoration is one of the ways, but it's not easy to find funding for that yet. So not a clear answer, but maybe again, by sharing and maybe linking your platform to some of the developments in other European countries, like in the Netherlands, could be a way forward. As far as I know, maybe David, you are now, it's just burning on you are now in Madrid, right? Where
yes,
the whole world, climate world is. Is it next to climate also a very little bit about nature there in Madrid, as what you hear from the news? Or is it, we are trying to learn. I'm trying to write a small fact sheet book, and we learn from climate as people in the biodiversity space, but also how is biodiversity different? There is so much momentum now. Is there also a little bit talk about nature?
Before moving to COP Madrid, yeah. I'm moving right now when I finish this webinar to attend a session from Business for Nature. I would like to ask something to answer the question about how to get funding. There is an international initiative which is called Conservation Finance for Investments, conservation, which is called CEPIC, which is working on this. Yeah. We are also work on this at the end or by the beginning of the next year in collaboration with the IUCN to see how the CF framework can help to assess which restoration projects provides more value to society in order to get investments and in order to see how can be invested. And regarding your question about how nature is linked to climate change issues, I fully agree with you that we, regarding the process, we need to learn a lot about the process of climate change and how can we apply it to biodiversity. In the conversations that I've been having, that I had in during the meetings here in Madrid, nature is always in the conversation. There are many sessions regarding biodiversity and how can biodiversity be integrated into climate change solutions. I think that there is no climate change solution without addressing biodiversity at the same time, because they are fully linked. And indeed, our government, which is leading this COP, it's trying to integrate this in the conversation. So I hope that on Friday, when finals conversation finish, we will have something regarding biodiversity and how to integrate it into climate change discussions.
Well, thank you very much for the time, and you will be you will take forward the nature discussion into the climate talks. There was one thing that I just thought maybe if you look for funding, there is the Natural Capital Financing Alliance of the European Investment Bank, might also be a tip. I don't want to forget it for my colleagues of the European Commission. David, have a good time at COP25. Thank you, Anna, for joining us. Reinhold, of course, thank you, and Harmke for making this all possible. And thank you, GLF, for this digital summit, and everybody online. If there are any questions, please send them to us, and we'll do our best to give a correct and effective answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.